thank you for joining us on the Serpents and Doves podcast. This is a Reformed confessional podcast of two Baptists that want to help God's people who have been sent out into this world to fulfill Jesus' command to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. We discuss the questions of our culture to help Christians give an answer. Welcome back to a Guns and God episode of Serpents and Doves. So glad to be with you today. I'm joined with my co-host Frank Butler, who is slightly under the weather, so he really has a distinct voice today. Frank, let's hear that voice.
What are you talking about? I'm feeling fantastic.
Yeah, you just sound like you're having personal revival right now. So, today we are talking about the subject of guns and God, and we want to discuss the Second Amendment. We want to talk about self-defense, and we want to talk about what the Christian's application is to these things, especially after the recent shooting in Sutherland Springs, Texas. And as we begin this, we would be amiss if we didn't say, remember to keep praying for that church and that pastor who seems to be very faithful in such a terribly hard time. We need to lift our brothers and sisters in Christ at First Baptist up to the Lord. But that being the case, after this terrible shooting, it is a time for us to reflect on these things and think about what the Christian's approach to guns should be. So really, there seems to be three approaches from when Frank and I were talking before this. The first approach is to always consider yourself a martyr and simply to always be passive in the threat of danger and to allow martyrdom. The second idea is always to shoot. Shoot first, ask questions later. That sounds very Pensacolean. And then maybe the more third approach, the more nuanced approach, is to, of course, analyze the situation and to follow the Sixth Commandment and follow the law of God when it comes to self-defense. So, Frank, I think you've got some scripture passages that you wanted to maybe start us out with.
Yeah, one of the first passages in response to the attitude that we should be pacifist. Exodus 22:2, the thief is caught while breaking in and is struck so that he dies. There will be no blood guiltiness on his account. And also Psalm 144:1, one I'm a particular fan of. Blessed be the Lord, my rock, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle. The scriptures, by and large, they're not pacifist. Jesus told his disciples to go out and buy a sword. When he told Peter to put the sword back in the sheath when he was being arrested in Gethsemane, he didn't say to throw away the sword, especially considering he had just told him to go buy it. Christians are not called to be pacifists. They're called to defend life, and they're called to do it rightly. We talked about this before in our episode on just war theory. There is a principle of biblical self-defense. If you are in a situation, if there is a need to protect you or the ones you love or innocent life in general, you have a biblical mandate to do so.
That's really good, and well said with a sore throat, I would say. You quoted Exodus 22 about self-defense at night, and if someone's breaking into your home, you have a right to self-defense, that the law of God commands that. And so when we're talking about the church and a situation like what happened this past weekend, we have to say to ourselves, if there's innocent life, the law of God has given us a divine prerogative.
The same principle you have for defending the innocent life in the womb is the same principle you have for defending the 4-year-old sitting in the pew in front of you.
John Piper wrote an article some time back, and it was entitled Guns and Martyrdom. And I think that there are a lot of Christians that are very pietistic and holy, and they hold to this kind of an approach, and I want to interact with it a little bit today. He writes in the article, Noelle, his wife, and I watch Beyond the Gates of Splendor. And I'll just stop for a minute. That's a documentary about Jim Elliot, who is this wonderful missionary to the Auca Indians in Ecuador, him and his very famous wife, Elizabeth, as well as other men on their team that went to Ecuador to reach an unengaged people group. And in that documentary that Piper watched, we see graphically how those missionaries had guns with them, yet they chose not to kill the Indians. They chose to allow the Indians to take their lives. And this is what Piper says. He says, the missionaries had guns when they were speared to death. One of them shot the gun into the air, it appears, as he was killed, rather than shooting the natives. They had agreed to do this. The reason was simple and staggeringly Christ-like. The natives are not ready for heaven. We are. Piper writes in the article, there are other reasons why I have never owned a firearm and do not have one in my house, but that reason moves me deeply. And then he encourages Christians not to buy guns in that article. So let me ask Frank, is that a different situation than someone breaking into your home or someone coming into the church?
That's an entirely different situation. And as much respect and love as you and I both have for Dr. Piper, I think that his worldview is being more influenced by humanism than Christianity at this point. While we do value human life, we also value the lives of those that we love and those that are around us that God has put under our care. So yes, like you said, there is a time for martyrdom. He mentioned that he was moved because the natives were not ready for heaven, but we were.
Isn't that a different situation? Because first off, Jim Elliot didn't have children there. His wife wasn't there, Elizabeth. None of the missionaries who gave their lives for Christ, none of their wives were there. And not to say their wives wouldn't have also been willing, but if they had their children there, would they have defended their children? So I think that it's a different scenario than someone breaking into your house, which is what the law of God is speaking of. And this also includes the issue of the Holy Spirit, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And that's something that I've heard Christians make that argument before. If we respond to these people, if we were to kill these people, we could condemn that man to hell because he has not yet accepted Christ. And I just say, let's be consistent Calvinist.
So break that down, because I agree with you.
I look at that, what Dr. Piper has written, and I say, if this person coming into my home to do my family harm is the gateway that God has used to send them to eternal damnation, then God has preordained that. That may sound determinist, but
without a doubt, the reality of the matter is that we're not sending them to hell. They've made a choice, a decision, and we'll give our free will friends all props of their own libertarian free will, right? They're doing exactly what the depraved mind would do. They're breaking into your house to harm you and harm your family. And so at that moment, you're getting exactly what free will does. And you're not sending them to hell. They have chosen to reject the God who created this world. And they have chosen to break his law and break the laws of our land by coming into your home. And you have a prerogative, a right, according to the 6th commandment. You shall not kill. You have a right to stop murder. In fact, the Westminster Larger Catechism in question 135, it asks this. It says, what are the duties required in the 6th commandment? So let me read them. The duties required are careful study and lawful endeavor to preserve the life of ourselves and others by resisting all thoughts and purposes, subduing all passions, and avoiding all occasions, temptations, and practices which tend to the unjust taking away of the life of any. So first off, it says that we need to stop heart murder. We need to fight against any thoughts or passions inside of us that would want to take away their life or harm somebody else. But then it says, and by just defense against violence and protecting and defending the innocent. So clearly, protecting and defending the innocent is a part of that command. It's not just negative, you should not kill, though the command is written in a negative way, but there are positive applications to that. If you should not kill, you should defend the innocent.
Right, and that's why the scriptures go on after the commandment is given to give actually situations where killing in the general sense is acceptable for God, such as capital punishment and self-defense.
And we have to remember that the word that is translated kill in the 10 Commandments could be much better translated murder. It's not killing, it's murder. That is the sin. So with that, we need to take a break, and we're going to be right back on segment 2 of Serpents and Doves. Welcome back to segment 2. We want to continue on talking about guns and God and the Christian life. So I want to read a passage from the book of Esther where we see in this important Old Testament book how God preserved the Jewish people. And this was very important because the Messiah, Jesus, was coming through the line of Israel. And in Esther chapter 8, we read about how the king, Ahasuerus, sends out a decree for the Jewish people. And this is what the decree says. The king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. So there's a caveat there. The caveat is anyone that would attack the Israelites, they would have a right to go ahead and to deal with them. And this is almost some sort of a preemptive type war. And God uses this in his plans to preserve the people of Israel. They would have been wiped out. We wouldn't have had Jesus as Messiah the way that God had planned from eternity past if it was not for those actions. So clearly in God's plans, he has chosen to allow self-defense as a viable option.
Are you suggesting that all things happen according to the counsel of his will?
I think I've read that somewhere before. So yeah, I'm suggesting that without a doubt.
Complementing that, in Nehemiah, you have, from that day on, half of my servants carried on the work, while half of them held the spears, the shields, the bows, and the breastplates. And the captains were behind the whole house of Judah, those who were rebuilding the wall, and those who carried... Sorry, the wall made me laugh. Those who were rebuilding the wall, and those who carried burdens, took their load with one hand, and doing the work, and the other holding the weapon.
So to be clear, that's not the Mexican-American wall.
Yeah, the first thing I thought of was Trump's wall.
Yeah. So, just to make it clear, we're talking about the wall around Jerusalem.
Which was so important to the defense of a city in that time period.
Yeah. Just the idea that God put a whole book in the Bible about a wall around Jerusalem tells us that self-defense can be important for a nation. And there's a lot of proverbs about this.
And it probably excites a lot of Republicans right now.
It probably does. And so this is not the same kind of wall, just to be clear, but that's for another podcast. Now, there is a time to lay your life down. And in the context of the Sermon on the Mount about turning the other cheek, we read about taking up the cross and following him. That means dying to self. And we recognize that there are times, like our brothers and sisters in Syria and in North Korea, where the church is under a despotic, anti-Christ regime. And when they are being persecuted simply for their faith, there is a time to lay our life down. But in the normal working of God in the world, we are called to preserve life, to protect life, to stop evil. And without a doubt, in the circumstances that we see in this country today of shootings, when we continue to see an increased violence in the cities and even in the suburbs now of people intruding into others' homes, we do have a biblical admonition to bring defense to our families.
Luke 11:21 tells us when a strong man, fully armed, guards his own house, his possessions are undisturbed.
So clearly Jesus is giving a parable there, and he's assuming that this is a normal thing for a man to defend his house. And he's not saying this is a bad thing, he's saying this is a good thing. And without that, anarchy reigns, correct?
Correct. We have the text that says when a strong man fully armed. Let's take that and apply it to today. If sitting in your bedroom next to your bedside is a fully loaded AR-15, you are fully armed to defend your house from any intruder. And from anyone coming to do harm to your family, to do harm to your children, to do harm to your possessions. And biblically, you have the right to do that.
Now, we need to be careful here to nuance this with the fact that we're not saying we put our trust in the firearm. We're not putting our trust in chariots or horses, correct? Or
Correct.
AR-15s.
No, we put our trust in God, who, if he has preordained me to pull that trigger and defend my family, then so be it.
What if you're alone? Let's do a different scenario. You're alone in your house. Your family's not there, and an intruder comes in. Could God lead you to have a conversation with the intruder? He might. We don't know. In that moment, that's the moment where you get led. If that intruder tries to harm you or hurt you, you have a biblical right to defend your life. Though, could it be that God might lead you to do otherwise? He may. He's sovereign God.
We need to point out real quick, we're talking about, in our context in particular, we're talking about restricting gun laws, restricting the right to bear arms, restricting access to weapons by a government that believes it's okay to kill babies. There's a contradiction there, guys. There's an inconsistent principle there.
We need to be consistent because the reality is that's the taking of innocent life. And the mother who is taking her child in her womb, in what's supposed to be the safest place in the world, a mother's womb, and she's taking it to a doctor and saying, kill this child. She is also committing murder. She has chosen to have her child killed. Any other crime in this country where you would do that, you would be considered an accomplice to the crime. If you're the guy who drives the getaway car and you don't rob the bank, you just are in the car and drive them off, you would be held in just as much liability for the crime as the man who actually held the gun.
She has essentially hired a hitman to take out her child. And the reason we bring that up is if you live in a society where you're being told you don't need weapons to defend yourself by the people who believe it's okay to kill children, you can't trust that government. And I'm not trying to sound like a tinfoil hat wearing conspiracist. I'm saying that this is what happens when we don't govern by what God has stated. We end up with situations like this where we believe life has no value at all.
What a sad place we're in today. So with that, we're going to take a break on kind of a sober note, and we'll be right back for our third segment.
Welcome back to segment 3 of Serpents and Doves. So what we're essentially saying when we're talking about an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, a life for a life, we're talking about just because you see a man causing a ruckus, even in your church, after what we've seen 2 weeks ago at this church in Texas, it doesn't mean immediately you need to draw your weapon and start laying down rounds on them. You need to be wise as serpents.
Change the scenario. You have your children at home. You hear your back door shatter, and you grab a firearm, and you walk to the back door to protect your family, and someone is standing there in your kitchen. This does not give you the immediate right to shoot them, even though you have a legal right to do so, at least in the state of Florida. But as a Christian, obviously, you have to make a judgment call. Is this person carrying a weapon? Is this person here to harm me? If you say, get on the ground, and you point a gun at them, and they get on the ground and put their hands behind their head and beg for their life, should you kill them? I would say biblically you should not kill them. But if they begin to attack you and resist you, then you have a right to defend yourself.
And when we look at the text in Exodus 22, it talks about the man breaking in at night. The principle behind that, the general equity behind that, is if the man is not identifiable.
Really important to point out that there were no guns when Moses gave that law. So think about this. We're talking beating someone with a rod, with a sword, stabbing them with a knife to death.
Much more gruesome.
Much more gruesome, much harder of a task to accomplish. And the law is saying that's okay. You may take their life in those methods because they have violated that which is supposed to be a free and safe place. And so they've come with bad intentions, and it is justifiable in that moment. But what we're not saying, back to even the church situation, we really believe every church should have a plan of action. It should be discussed. These are not things that should be left undiscussed. And we're not saying because someone disturbs your church service, you pull a gun out.
Seriously, if you're listening to this, though, you should have that discussion with your elders. Guys, do we have a plan of action? Do we have a security idea happening here? Do we have something happening that if something were to occur, we have a way to respond to it?
Yeah, I remember years ago we had a very elderly lady who said, Pastor, come over here. And I came over and she said, don't ever worry, I've got your back in the pulpit. I looked at what she was pointing at, and inside of her pink purse, she had a little pink pistol. And I was like, oh, please don't ever take that out. We're fine. We've got people to handle those things. Because the reality is, imagine the anarchy if someone comes in that causes a disturbance and 6 people pull out weapons. So you're gonna harm the innocent by accident.
Which is why you need to have a planned security team, is the best way to put that.
Just like you should have a plan in your own personal home and be prepared to defend your family and know how you would do it, same in the church.
In my home, my wife knows exactly what to do in a situation where someone tries to break into our home. I've drilled her through this. She knows the plan of action to take so that they're out of the way and I can properly defend our home without worrying about putting them at risk as well.
And that's so wise. That's exactly what God calls us to do, to be wise stewards of the lives that God has given and entrusted us with. Now, in our last few moments, we want to talk about total depravity for a minute, because you brought up a point about total depravity and why we have police forces and these kind of things. And I think it's very relevant.
When I'm asked about the Second Amendment, my views of gun control or lack thereof, I'll put my cards on the table. If a man wants to own a tank in his garage, that's between him and the Lord. I'm very, very free on this topic. And the reason
I know your garage isn't big enough to have a tank, so at this moment you don't have one. Just in case the FBI was listening, the CIA was listening to this podcast.
Well, I think that the CIA should be aware he has a tank so they know their limits.
There you go.
But the reason I have the views of an open market of weaponry is because I believe man is evil. Because I believe that man has a broken nature, that the thoughts and intentions of his heart are nothing but evil, according to the scriptures. So because of that, in the shortest way I can put it, if man is inherently evil, broken in sin, I don't see any wisdom in saying that the most powerful small group in the entire nation should be the only ones that have the weapons to kill everybody else.
That's a great point. And why do we have even police forces and such? I mean, if you're against anyone owning weapons, then you should really be against the police force, because it's not just a gun. A gun is a lethal weapon, but it's also an object of sobriety that can defend the innocent. So it can be used for good or evil. It's amoral, like any other object can be used for good or evil, any other weapon. And if you're against the private ownership, then why would you allow a small select group of people to have these weapons?
Well, if I could be slightly controversial for a moment, I think when we say that I don't own weapons, private citizens should not own weapons, the police, the government, the federals, they own the weapons, they will take care of us. I think, honestly, that you are ignoring the biblical command to self-defense. When it talks about the thief breaking in your house at night, you're commanded to defend yourself and your family. You're commanded to defend innocent life. And when you push that off on the police force, you're relieving yourself of the responsibility to protect innocent life and to protect yourself and giving it to someone else. The first line of self-defense is self.
You want to be a good steward of the life and family that God has given you. So I think we're out of time. We are so glad that you listened today to the Serpents and Doves podcast. Please let us know what you think on Facebook. Join the conversation. Please like, share this podcast. Give us a 5-star on iTunes to help us get visibility out there.
And if you don't like what we've said, come over to Facebook and tell us why.